VOX Pop presentation. I'll give you a 10-second countdown. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Henry, and I'm with the Library of American Broadcasting, a research library at the University of Maryland dedicated to the history of radio and television broadcasting. It's a wide-ranging collection of both primary and secondary sources that include books and magazines, photographs, scripts, audio and video recordings, personal paper collections, documenting the entire history of radio and television broadcasting from really the experimental days of the late 19th century all the way up to the present. And we're open to the public, 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday. You don't need to be a member of the university or associated with the university in any way. We work with high school students, college students, professors, professional historians, documentary filmmakers, anyone who has an interest in broadcasting in any way. So we welcome your visit. We're easy to find on the internet. Now today I'm going to be giving a presentation on a program called VOX Pop, and we actually have the papers of the man who hosted the show, a man named Parks Johnson, who you'll be seeing quite often through the course of this presentation, on this PowerPoint presentation. And Parks Johnson was a prolific collector of material. He saved almost everything that he produced from this show. As you can see here, that includes recordings of the broadcast, photographs taken during the broadcast, notebook. He created notebook entry, creating logs of each broadcast, and I'll be showing you an example of one of those. Letters from listeners, but also letters, business correspondence with advertising agencies and military officials and anyone who's involved in putting on one of these shows. Promotion material. He saved posters, magazine ads, anything that was used to promote the show over the 16 years it was on the air from 1932 to 1948. He also kept scrapbooks with clippings and other memorabilia. He also collected pins and trinkets that the show collected, he and the co-host collected along their travels. Now, this and this is Parks Johnson here. During this presentation, I'll be giving you an overview of the show's history, and I will be concentrating on one of their particular broadcasts that they did from Walter Reed Hospital in Washington, D.C. in March of 1943, at the height of World War II. So I think you'll get a really good example of how the show worked, and I'll be using photographs that were taken during the broadcast, as well as letters and notebook entries that were produced afterwards, so you can get the whole history of that, even that one particular broadcast. The show began in 1932 as a man-on-the-street interview program on the streets of Houston, Texas. It aired on radio station KTRH, which was actually broadcast from the Rice Hotel. Therefore, hence the initials for the station, TRH, the Rice Hotel. And what inspired him and other personnel at the station to create this man-on-the-street interview program were two things. One, Ted Husing, the sports announcer and broadcaster, had actually started a man-on-the-street interview program a couple weeks before in New York City, and asking people about their thoughts on the upcoming presidential election. So I guess looking around for programming ideas, Parks Johnson, the other officials at KTRH, kind of picked up that idea and thought, well, why don't we apply this to a local market? And that's exactly what they did. So they just set up their microphone and their transmitting equipment down on the street right in front of the hotel and began interviewing people. When the show started, since the show started with the motivation of asking people a topical, newsworthy question like the presidential election, the early format of the show had that format. and so I'll show you. So here's an example of some other photographs that will show that. But when it started out, since they started with asking people a topical news-related question, the earliest episodes continue to do that, asking a different topical political question through every week. We actually have a broadcast from January of 1935, when they're still on the streets of Houston, and the question of the day was, do you think Hoffman was guilty? Because that was the very week that the Lindbergh kidnapping trial started. And so when you listen to that broadcast, you get real good insight on what people's opinions and thoughts at the time were about Hoffman. And it was very interesting when you hear it. Everyone almost to a person says that they think he was guilty just because they saw him in the newsreel. Well, he looks guilty, he must be guilty. So it's a if anyone wants to follow up on that and do any of you who are Lindbergh scholars, that might be an interesting broadcast to listen to. But from 1932 until 1935, the show had become so popular and so successful in Houston that a producer from NBC heard the show and thought to bring it to a nationwide network audience on NBC. So in 1935, Parks Johnson and his co-host Jerry Belcher brought the show to New York City. And the photo you see on the left was a pretty typical broadcast from this mid and late 1930s period, where they would broadcast from hotel lobbies, theaters, supper clubs, and in this case, since they're with NBC, they're broadcasting from the lobby of the RCA building at Rockefeller Center. And so you can see if you look closely, you can see Parks Johnson, and behind him you see Wally Butterworth, who was his second announcer, second co-host. And if you look right behind, you see a gentleman whose head is obscured. His head is right under the word "Tonight." That's Graham McNamee. And Graham McNamee was the announcer for the show. So, and if you look at closely, you can actually tell it's him just from his profile. But in the collection, we have many, many photographs that were taken to the broadcast. And you can actually, if you go to our website, we have actually scanned and digitized all 2,000 of those photographs and put them on our website on an online photo archive. So you can see this photo and all the photos I'll be showing you. And it's very interesting, many of the photos have this banner that you see here. This banner, which you can see, is for when they were sponsored by Kentucky Club Tobacco. When they came to New York, their first sponsor was Fleischmann Yeast. And then in 1938, they began to be sponsored by Kentucky Club. In 1941, Bromo Seltzer took up sponsorship. After the war, they were sponsored by Lipton Tea for a brief time, and then by American Express traveler's checks. So we'll be hearing more about that later. But you also see on the right, they also broadcast from the New York World's Fair for both seasons of the fair. In 1939, for the 1939 season, they were still with NBC. So naturally, they broadcast from the RCA Pavilion. And I'm sure most of you have seen at least pictures of the pavilion, the one that looks like a vacuum tube. So they broadcast from there, again, interviewing people who attended the fair. So it's a really good document of the New York World's Fair, at least from the first season. But in October of 1939, they moved from NBC to CBS. So for the second season of the fair in 1940, they continued to broadcast from the fair, but from other locations. And in this photograph, you see they're broadcasting from the Westinghouse Pavilion, and there's Electro. They're trying to get Electro hooked on Kentucky Club Tobacco products. And you can actually see Wally Butterworth, Wally Butterworth was a longtime NBC announcer, and he was Parks Johnson's co-host from 1936 to 1942. Because in 1936 he replaced Jerry Belcher when Jerry Belcher